In 2014, a team of archaeologists digging beneath a gravel parking lot in eastern Poland found the concrete foundations of a gas chamber. They also found the personal belongings of the people murdered inside it: identity documents, gold teeth, a child's shoe, and a small Star of David necklace that still had a name attached to it. But the most disturbing part of what they found was not beneath the ground. It was inside the archives. Because the record showed that Soviet authorities had surveyed this exact location in 1944. They had documented the graves, and then they had said nothing for 50 years.
Sobibor was not a concentration camp. There were no barracks for prisoners, no labor assignments, no selections on the platform. When the trains arrived at Sobibor, the passengers were dead within 2 hours. That was the design. Built in the spring of 1942 in occupied Poland as part of Operation Reinhard, the Nazi program to exterminate every Jewish man, woman, and child in the general government territory, Sobibor existed for one purpose only. Between April 1942 and October 1943, an estimated 170,000 to 250,000 people were murdered there. Then the Nazis demolished the camp, plowed the earth flat, and planted trees over the mass graves. They built a farmhouse on top. They intended for Sobibor to vanish from history entirely. For decades, it very nearly did. The killing began with paperwork. In January 1942, at a villa on the shores of Lake Wannsee outside Berlin, senior Nazi officials gathered to coordinate what they called the final solution to the Jewish question. The Wannsee Conference lasted 90 minutes. The minutes of that meeting, which survived the war and were introduced as evidence at Nuremberg, record the fates of 11 million people, discussed in the language of bureaucratic logistics. Sobibor was one of 3 camps constructed specifically to implement those decisions. The other 2 were Belzec and Treblinka. Together, they would become the engine of Operation Reinhard. Construction at Sobibor was overseen by SS officer Richard Tomala in early 1942. The camp was deliberately placed in a remote area of the Lublin district, screened from view by forest, accessible only by a single railway branch line. This was not an accident of geography. It was architecture designed for secrecy. The SS commandant who would run the camp for most of its operation was Franz Stangl, an Austrian policeman who had already overseen the T4 euthanasia program, where disabled German citizens were gassed in sealed rooms. Stangl brought that experience to Sobibor. He refined it. He industrialized it. The deception was total and deliberate. When transports arrived, passengers were told they had reached a transit camp. They were instructed to hand over valuables for safekeeping. They were told to remember their locker numbers. Jewish prisoners forced to work in the camp, the Sonderkommando, were ordered to maintain the pretense, to reassure the new arrivals, to keep the line moving. The gas chambers at Sobibor were disguised as shower facilities. From arrival to death, the process took less than 2 hours. Stangl later told journalist Gita Sereny in a 1971 interview that he had thought of the victims not as people, but as cargo. That word, cargo, tells you everything about what Sobibor was built to do. On October 14, 1943, the prisoners of Sobibor did something the SS had calculated was impossible. They fought back. The uprising was organized in secret over several weeks, led primarily by Alexander Pechersky, a Soviet Jewish officer who had been captured at the front and transported to Sobibor in late September. Pechersky and the underground he built had one plan: lure the SS officers into the workshops one by one, kill them with axes and knives before the alarm could be raised, then walk out through the main gate. On that October afternoon, 11 SS men were killed. Approximately 300 prisoners broke through the perimeter fence. Of those, roughly 50 survived the war. Heinrich Himmler received word of the revolt within hours. His response was immediate and revealing. He did not order the camp rebuilt or secured. He ordered it destroyed. Not just closed, erased. Within weeks, the gas chambers were demolished. The railway platform was torn up. The barracks were burned. SS units then directed prisoners, before killing them, to dig up portions of the mass graves and burn the remains on open pyres, a process known as Aktion 1005, the Nazi program designed specifically to destroy evidence of mass murder across the occupied East. When that work was done, those prisoners too were shot.
By the spring of 1944, where Sobibor had stood, there was a farm. Trees had been planted in deliberate rows across the mass graves. A Ukrainian guard named Karl Frenzel, who had participated in the killings, reportedly helped oversee the final landscaping. The ground was flat. The forest was quiet. From the air, from the road, from any angle a human eye could find, there was nothing. That was the intention. Sobibor was not simply a place where 250,000 people were murdered. It was a place that was then unmade, its physical evidence systematically destroyed by the people who created it, in the full knowledge of what they had done.
The earth at Sobibor was not empty. It never was. In 2001, Polish archaeologist Andrzej Kola of Nikolaus Copernicus University conducted the first systematic ground survey of the site. Using core drilling, his team located mass graves containing the remains of tens of thousands of victims. The scale of what lay beneath the soil was confirmed. But the physical structure of the murder, the gas chambers, the pipelines, the machinery, remained elusive. The forest had grown back. A memorial had been built. But the actual killing apparatus, the architectural proof of what had happened here, had not been found. That changed in 2014. An Israeli-Polish-Dutch team, led by archaeologist Yoram Jaime and his colleague Wojciech Mazurka, began a more intensive excavation of the area that records suggested had once been the camp's inner compound. What they found, beneath a gravel parking lot, built decades earlier without any apparent awareness, or perhaps with full awareness of what lay beneath, were the concrete foundations of the gas chambers. The dimensions matched survivor testimony precisely. The layout confirmed what historians had reconstructed from witness accounts alone. For the first time, there was physical, undeniable, architectural proof of the mechanism of murder at Sobibor.
Around and within those foundations, the team recovered thousands of personal artifacts: coins, combs, razors, the kinds of objects taken from people who believed they were being resettled, who had packed for a journey. A Star of David necklace was recovered and cross-referenced with deportation records, tracing it to a specific individual who had been transported to Sobibor from the Netherlands in 1943.
One necklace, one name, one of 250,000. The archaeologists working that site have said publicly that the excavation is not finished, that they believe they have not yet found all of the graves. The ground at Sobibor is still giving up what was hidden inside it.
Here is the fact that demands an explanation. Soviet military units reached the Sobibor area in the summer of 1944, less than a year after the camp had been demolished. They conducted surveys, they interviewed local witnesses, they documented in writing the existence of mass graves at the site. Those reports entered Soviet archives, where they remained classified and inaccessible for decades. This was not bureaucratic oversight. The Soviet state had a deliberate ideological position regarding the Nazi genocide. The victims were to be framed as Soviet citizens, not as Jews specifically targeted for racial extermination. Acknowledging Sobibor fully would have required acknowledging the particular targeted nature of what had happened there. That was politically inconvenient, so the files were closed. The Polish communist government, which administered the site after the war, was no more forthcoming. A memorial was eventually constructed at Sobibor, but excavation was discouraged, and the full scale of the burial sites was not publicly acknowledged. When Franz Stangl was finally brought to trial in West Germany in 1970, 27 years after the camp's closure, his conviction for the murder of 900,000 people produced headlines across Europe. But the trial produced almost no pressure to excavate Sobibor itself, to locate and identify the remains of his victims. The graves remained where they were. The trees continued to grow.
It was not until Poland's post-communist political transformation, and eventually the international collaboration that produced the 2014 excavation, that the site could be investigated with the full resources and institutional will it required. What the 2014 team found was not a discovery that had simply been waiting for technology to catch up. The mass graves had been documented. The location was known. What had been missing for 50 years was not information. It was political will. And that distinction matters enormously, because it means the silence around Sobibor was not ignorance. It was a choice, made by governments, recorded in their own files, and maintained decade after decade, while the survivors aged and the witnesses died, and the forest grew taller over the dead.
The archaeological work at Sobibor is still ongoing. Researchers believe they have not yet mapped all of the burial sites. The identities of the vast majority of the 170,000 to 250,000 people murdered there remain unknown. Their names lost to the same systematic erasure that destroyed the camp itself. What Sobibor tells us is not only what human beings are capable of doing to one another. It tells us what institutions are capable of doing with that knowledge afterward. The suppression of evidence, the management of inconvenient history, the decision to let the ground stay quiet. These are not ancient failures. They are documented, deliberate acts carried out within living memory. The earth remembered. It took us 50 years to be willing to listen.